Welcome back to another edition of Viper Bites. And this time we're going to do a little bit of a 3-4 part mini series here, highlighting some of the highest risk injury players for fantasy football. And as you can see here, we are going to start off talking about the quarterback position. Now, full disclosure, I am not a doctor, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express. So that does qualify me to talk about this to a certain degree. Now, when you touch the ball every single down, the likelihood of something bad happening, that increases. It's really that simple. The more you have the ball, the higher risk you run. Now take the quarterback position. Every single drop back leads itself to injury risks, from blindside hits to finger smashing off helmets every time you release the ball. Kyler Murray was the only top 12 fantasy quarterback last year who failed to play in 15 games or more. If your quarterback goes down at any point, streaming fantasy options can be a scary place. Now let's take a look at the number one injury risk quarterback out there right now for fantasy. And you guessed it, it's Tua Tagovailoa. Now, when we look at the things that he has been, his hip injury, that has been well documented. There will always be a risk of further complications with his hip that may shorten his career. But looking at last season, Tagovailoa was one of the most accurate passers in the NFL, especially against the blitz. Last season, with the rib and finger injuries, he was only able to play in 12 games there, missing 4 games, finishing with 2,653 passing yards and 16 touchdowns to go along with 10 interceptions. 16 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. That's not good, Bob. Now, if you are drafting Tagovailoa, it is best that you go out there and you make sure that he's your QB2 and you secure a top option there at the quarterback position. Now, the next quarterback on our list, he is Carson Wentz of the now Washington Commanders. Now, he injured both his ankles versus the Rams last season, never got himself right, but he still managed to play 17 games. Well, why are we talking about him? 17 games? That's good. Except we're talking about injury prone versus lack of production due to injury. And yes, he had the production of 27 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, 3,563 passing yards. But yet, when it was all said and done, the Indianapolis Colts chose it was time to move on from Carson Wentz. Why? Probably the reason why Indianapolis felt it was time for him to part ways was that injury history. Going back to Philadelphia, he's probably still a little bit of gun shy there from his time in Philadelphia. I mean, he was getting hit often and he was getting hit hard. In 6 seasons, Wentz, he has only played 16 or more games 3 times. He is best to be left as a streaming option here for your fantasy rosters. Now, if you want to look back here, September 19th, 2021, Wentz suffered those ankle injuries in that week 2 game against the Los Angeles Rams. He was available to play, but he wasn't the same. He was like the Black Knight, essentially, from the Monty Python skits. It is but a flesh wound after both his legs were chopped off. Now, going back to July, a little bit earlier there in training camp, he injured his foot in training camp. Like I said, he missed the remainder of the preseason. January 5th, 2020, Carson Wentz, he suffered a concussion in the team's wild card loss to the Seattle Seahawks. You remember that. He basically went down. He was pretty much punch drunk at that point. October 11th, 2018, exact date, not quite sure of this exactly. I just got through that October 11th date out there. He was having back troubles. And this goes back to early October. He missed the final 3 games of the year, but he did manage to avoid surgery. Going back to 2017 there, December, Wentz departed the second quarter of a game thanks in part to a torn ACL. He did manage to return week 3 of the 2018 season. So you can see there is a lengthy history of injuries. Now, the next quarterback up here, the number 3 risk when it comes to fantasy and injury, it's Joe Burrow. Now, Joe Burrow, we love ourselves some Joe Burrow on here. Even I do. I've come around to the LSU guy. And hey, but look, last season, Burrow, he was sacked 51 times. And when you get hit that many times, you are going to run a greater risk. It's that simple. But the Bengals, they did invest heavily here this offseason to ensure that their franchise quarterback stays protected for most of the season. Now, Burrow, he still threw for 3,734 yards, 34 touchdowns, Well, he took it on the chin in 2021. Could you imagine what he is capable of if he has time? The Bengals here, they need to avoid a Carson Wentz type situation where Burrow is looking over his shoulder all the time. We know Burrow's a tough guy. He stands in the pocket. He takes those hits, but you can only take those hits so many times before you start to see ghosts every now and then, a la Sam Darnold in his days with the New York Jets. Now, in 2020, Burrow, he did miss 6 games, sat out the season finale there in 2021. That was probably more rest for the playoffs. With the offensive line upgrades here, there are zero concerns here as far as Joe Burrow is concerned. But you know what? Hey, those knee injuries, they are starting to add up. We talked about that one he took in the Super Bowl there as well, that sprained MCL in those final minutes of the Super Bowl. And then if you go back to January 2nd, he kind of twisted the knee towards the end of that Kansas City game. December 5th, 2021, suffered that dislocated pinky finger in that loss to the Chargers. So that's some injuries there last season he was dealing with. And of course, we know what he dealt with in 2020. Torn MCL, torn ACL, torn meniscus, torn PCL, anything that was possibly in that knee, he tore it. It's that simple. Now let's move on to our number 4 ranked injury risk quarterback here, and that is Daniel Jones of the New York Football Giants. Now, when we look at what he has, November 28th, 2021, cervical neck strain, suffered a season-ending injury in the Giants' Week 12 game against the Eagles. He was placed on the IR. He then went on to miss 6 games. October 10th, 2021, concussion in the Week 5 contest. He was declared, he was cleared for the next game, but he probably shouldn't have been. Now, December 16th, 2020, thigh hamstring strain. Jones re-injured his right hamstring strain that limited his ability to run and that lost to the Arizona Cardinals. We obviously know that originally dates back to that November 29th injury of 2020. And then somewhere in between there, bro, December 13th, he also had an ankle sprain. So we know he's taken some bumps and bruises, but hey, let's talk about Daniel Jones and what this could mean for fantasy football. Missed 12 games in 3 seasons, including those 6 games that I mentioned last year. Now, Giants and Jones, they feel good about his health heading into 2020, including that neck injury, especially with Brian Daboll there as the new head coach. We've seen those significant hamstring injuries creep up in the past. We saw him with that punch drunk, unable to make a standing 8 count there in that one loss there way back when. But hey, for those fantasy managers that have that risk it, kind of go for it mentality, friendliest strength of schedule for fantasy quarterbacks belongs to Daniel Jones and the New York Football Giants. He's basically a QB2 with some weekly upside that could find himself scratching the surface of the QB1 from week to week. I'm not saying he's a QB1, but there is a potential that he could crack the top 12 at some point next season. Now, a couple more quarterbacks I'm just going to throw out there at you right now because these guys are pretty obvious, but what about Kyler Murray and Josh Allen? We know the running quarterback always puts themselves at risk. You can throw Lamar Jackson here as well, but for Josh Allen, for example, we know he had turf toe. We know he has got concussion. We know he sprained that AC joint back in 2017. When you are the primary running option for your team, you're probably going to get hit more often than you want to be. Now, Singletary, he was better down the stretch. The Buffalo Bills, they went out there and they got themselves James Cook in the draft to hopefully alleviate some of that pressure from Josh Allen in the running game. He hasn't missed time since 2018, and that was 4 games back then. Now, for Josh Allen, he ranked as a top 5 quarterback in 8 separate weeks last year, and he finished outside the top 15 only 4 times. Now, when we make that transition from Daboll to Ken Dorsey, by the way, he's the guy who banged the table there for Ken Dorsey. I don't think we're going to have any kind of hesitation there on success for Josh Allen. Now, Kyler Murray, on the other hand, look at these things. Sprained ankle there, October 2021. You go back to November 19th, 2020. That's where he had that AC joint. Maybe those are some of the effects of injuries that kind of led to maybe a little bit of his fantasy demise down the stretch. But we got to be monitoring his current contract situation closely. And like I said, Allen, Jackson, Murray, always going to run that risk of getting injured there as running quarterbacks. Last couple of years, started off fire, fizzled out down the stretch. And I think those are talking about those ankle sprain and that AC joint really kind of dug in him a little bit towards the end. 14 of 17 games is what he played last year. But you have to treat him as a quarterback 1 for fantasy because despite playing 3 less games than pretty much everyone, he still finished as a top 10 fantasy option at the quarterback position. Now, some other quarterbacks that we could throw out there that have a history of injury. You've got your Derek Carrs, you got your Aaron Rodgers, Patrick Mahomes, Justin Herbert. These guys all suffered injuries. Matthew Stafford probably has one of the longest running lists of injuries there. But really, last year, he stayed himself pretty healthy, but we did see good Stafford versus bad Stafford. Stafford started off good, kind of got dinged up along the way, struggled there towards the end of the season, and the playoffs became good Stafford again. With that all being said, that's just a few of the quarterbacks here that you need to keep an eye on for your fantasy season here, heading into it here. When you're looking at the drafts, if you're running a risk of injury, you're going to want to make sure that you back that quarterback up. Because, hey, if you don't have a good quarterback, you're probably going to be scratching the barrel, and who knows, do you really want Sam Darnold on your team? You really want to be starting Sam Darnold more than once a year if you absolutely don't have to. That being said, make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and make sure you are tuned in and got those notifications turned on the Vipers Network for more videos coming your way very soon. We'll see you next time.